All right, so the story for this particular lesson is about the abbot. It's called the ripple. So basically, this monk went up to his head monk, the abbot, for advice, and the head monks asked him to throw a stone into the pond. So as the ripples come closer to shore, the monk is supposed to use his finger to kind of stop these ripples, but you know, he tries and obviously he fails, and it's only causing more ripples. So the head monk was like, yeah, actually you can't stop the ripples that form, but you could stop yourself from tossing the stone in the first place, couldn't you? So hopefully that's something that we can all learn and apply. Okay, so what we'll cover. So in the first part, we'll cover demand, supply, and market equilibrium. So that's the first part. And in the next part, we'll cover elasticity and price control. All right. So what's demand and supply? So it's something we often hear a lot, right? So demand basically is something that looks at from the consumer's point of view or the buyer's point of view. So basically, if something is more expensive, we will buy less of it. Consumers will buy less of it. And the law of supply looks from the producer's point of view. So the more expensive it is, the more producers will supply, right? So basically, if it's more, even if it makes more money, producers want to produce more. It's more expensive, right? So there will be a certain point at which the price and the quantity demanded meet, right? The buyers will buy along a certain curve and the producers will produce along a certain curve. So when they finally meet, we call that equilibrium, right? So there are many other independent factors that affect how demand and supply works, but for this particular introduction, we'll just look at demand and supply in a very basic and general term, right? So what exactly is demand? Demand is the demand for a good or service is the quantity that consumers would wish to buy at a specific price at a particular point in time. Okay, so we have to remember that demand is time specific, time bound. Right? So basically, if something is more expensive, people don't want to buy it, or if something is not popular, generally you can't sell it for very high. Okay, so this is how the demand curve looks like. It's a downward sloping curve, because remember, as we said, as price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. So as price goes from PA to PB, the quantity also increased from QA to QB, right? Usually the curve is not a straight line. Usually it's a curve, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just use a straight line. So the steepness of the curve, it depends on the elasticity, so of which we will discuss a bit later, all right? In the next video, actually. So here's an example of how we kind of interpret the curve. Okay, so when we're looking at demand curves, we must understand two things. There are two possible scenarios that could happen. The first being that there's a movement along the curve, and the other one is that there's a shift in the curve, meaning the curve itself shifts, and so that means that it's an increase in demand. Or if the curve itself doesn't shift, we call that a movement. So it just moves along from point A to point B. So what happens when this happens is a movement usually happens when there is actually no increase in demand, meaning the demand is the same. There's no new factors that have changed the demand. So therefore, there's just a movement along the demand curve. So in this case, basically in this example, the price of a car has increased, right? Increased from 36 to 37,000. So how would this affect the number of cars demanded, right? So it's the quantity sold in that sense. How would this affect? So it affects because there will be less cars demanded. So even though the price increased by $1,000, the amount of cars, the quantity demanded has dropped by 150 cars. So because it's more expensive, less people want to buy, and there's a movement. Demand itself hasn't changed. It's just that it's still the same amount of demand, just that at that price, only this amount of cars will be sold. All right. So I keep saying that, oh, it's a movement and this is a shift. A shift happens when there is something that happens to cause demand to actually increase. So, for example, there is a new law that the government passed saying that all cars need to install a IU unit, right? Infrared unit, something like that. So when that happens, there is an increase in demand. So the curve will actually shift. So for this particular scenario, the the students, international students have been allowed into the country, and that means that demand will actually increase. Demand for rental units will actually increase because there are actually more students. So meaning that even at the same price, even at the same price point of $600 per week, you will actually be able to get more students. The quantity demanded is higher, 7,000 in this case, because it's a shift in the demand, right? So it's not a movement of price, it's a shift in demand because there's a real increase in demand. Similarly, if let's say the government issues quotas on, say, cars, right? Each family can only have one car. So the demand for cars would drop in this particular case, and therefore, even though it's at the same price, there'll be less cars demanded because demand has actually shifted. So there are exceptions. Okay, so demand, some goods, the more expensive it is, the more people want it, more desirable it becomes, right? So things like luxury goods, things like your supercars, right? Your Pagani Huayra, stuff like that. The supercars are a luxury good because they are expensive. They are highly desirable because they communicate something more than just a functional demand, right? It's no longer just a rational thing. It's, to some extent, it's irrational. So things like diamonds, diamond jewelry, right? Diamonds themselves not really worth a lot, but why people pay crazy amounts of money is because there is a certain desirability behind it. And the desirability comes from the fact that it is communicating a certain status or a certain, or it communicates something more than just the function of it, right? So this kind of luxury goods, we call it a Veblen good, right? So a Veblen good is basically a luxury good that increases in desirability despite its very high price. Okay, so a given good is the opposite way around. It's an inferior good. So we often say that if the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, right? But what happens in the case of, say, war? So price of the good goes up, but the demand for the goods will not go down. It will still go up because of the situation that's happening. So it's an inferior good and there are no substitutes for it, and you consume it quite substantially. So things like bread, rice, stuff like that during wartime or famine time, generally this will behave as a given good. All right. So other than price, what actually affects demand, right? What causes demand to shift basically, right? So we know price causes demand to movement along the demand curve. So what causes demand to shift? So these are really the, in a nutshell, these are what causes demand to shift, right? The consumer tastes and preferences have changed. On average, the increase in income, the country has become richer, the market has become richer, so the taste change. Instead of wanting mashed potato, they now want, I don't know, fine dining gourmet mashed potatoes, stuff like that, right? So what I've just mentioned is not just an increase in demand that has caused a change in the consumers' taste and preferences. It's also the idea of a substitute good. Now the normal mashed potato, the $2.50 mashed potato, is no longer desirable because the substitute, which is the gourmet mashed potato, which is, I don't know, $7.50, is now more desirable, right? So it's a substitute for it. And complementary goods are things that go along with the mashed potato, right? Things that go along with your main good. So if let's say mashed potato is $2.50, but the cost of your mashed potato gravy has gone up from 50 cents to $5. Yeah, people will not want, people will start wanting less mashed potato, right? Because the gravy is so expensive now. So similarly, what do you expect the future price to be like? And whether or not there's a demographic shift, meaning that is there more people in the market? The less people in the market, population increase, population decrease. These are all factors that affect demand. So we have looked at the buyer's perspective, the consumer's perspective. Now we look at the producer's perspective, which is supply, right? So supply is sort of like the inverse of demand in a way, right? So the higher the price, the more the producer is willing to produce, right? Because if you are the producer, you think about it. If I can make more money, I will produce more. So it slopes upwards. The more I produce, the more expensive it is, the more I want to produce. So let's use this example. Okay, so in this case, the price went down. It has gone down. The price has gone down. So as a supplier, right, as a producer, do I want to produce more? No, because the price has gone down. I make less money. So therefore, I actually am not incentivized to produce more, right? I am disincentivized from producing more. So at 35,000, I only want to produce 600 cars. So, so this is the movement along the curve, similar to the demand, but this is just a movement along the curve because it's price based. Now we're talking about a shift in supply. So what causes a shift in supply? We'll look at the determinants later, but a shift in supply basically is like when there is actually an ability to increase production without basically sacrificing the cost, right? You don't actually sacrifice the amount of money, meaning that even at the same price point, I can actually produce more. So that causes an increase in supply, a shift in the supply. So things like new technologies will cause a shift. So in this case, you can see fracking has caused even though the price of oil in this case is $150 per barrel, but because of the new technology, I can actually produce more, 7,000 barrels of oil. And because of that, my curve has actually shifted rather than moved along the line. At the same price point, I produce more. So determinants, what are the determinants or the factors affecting supply? It's quite similar to demand. It's advanced, but they have a couple more things. So number of suppliers. So this is about, in a way, this is about market structure, right? It's a monopoly, oligopoly, stuff like that. Cost of production, it has become cheaper to produce stuff. Advance in technology, it becomes more efficient to produce stuff, cheaper to produce stuff. I can produce more stuff more quickly. Price of substitutes, future expected price fluctuations. I think these are quite straightforward. Change in the physical environment, flood, disaster, forest fires. And the last one will be a change in the business climate, meaning that the government actually steps in, right? The government has decided to intervene, and they can intervene through a blunt instrument or a less blunt instrument. So they can use a blunt instrument like a price floor or price ceiling, which we will touch in the next video. And or they can use finer instruments such as incentives or disincentives, right? Some of it can come in the form of subsidies or taxes. So if I put the demand and supply as a summary, this will be a good summary. You can take picture, you can pause the video here just to kind of take a screenshot so that it's easier to remember. And so when the two meet, we call that equilibrium. Okay, so the demand will meet with supply at a particular price point at a particular quantity. All right, so in this case, we're looking at a case example where rental in South Korea is $500 per week, and demand and supply meet at equilibrium, right? $500 and 5,000 units. But the government has two new regulations, a new tax, and allowing more visitors to come into the country. So the first one we understand, a tax means that now the business climate is less positive, supply would decrease. So the supply curve will actually shift, allowing more people to come in. It's a demographic shift, demand will shift right. So there's an increase in demand. So what will happen now? So we have just mentioned, tax causes supply to shift, to decrease, and having more foreigners increases the demographic, changes demand from D1 to D2. So when you put all together, everything together, at the new demand, at the new equilibrium point, you can see that price is a lot higher. The quantity demanded has decreased slightly, but the price has gone up eye-wateringly. So this is actually a very real effect of what happens when you have a decrease in supply and a crazy increase in demand, right? Okay, so with this, we can go for our coffee break, and then we'll come back to the next video to talk about the price elasticity of demand, as well as whatever price controls governments may introduce. All right. Okay.